Next month, August 2025, marks 54 years since the world left the gold standard and 81 years since the United States took over the mantle from the UK of having the world's reserve currency. Also, it was obvious that from the year 1920 and the end of the First World War, that the United States would be the dominant world power because they had the gold to back its currency. Now, it is also obvious to me, anyway, that the further we move away from 1971, which 54 years ago, which ended the gold standard, the world is going further down the financial rabbit hole and a debt level that is unsustainable. It is also obvious to me that the world's central banks are running out of ideas to be able to manipulate the gold price and therefore now buying gold and not selling it. I am astounded that the United States still have a philosophy of printing money or otherwise debt to pay back the debt. If this debt has an interest rate attached as it does, how can any sound person see the logic in that, especially looking at short and long-term history, that no country has succeeded in doing so? My question is, knowing that gold and silver is legal money and is the only workable plan, approximately how long has the world got? And do you agree with me that the falls in the price will be very shallow and that the price rises will be dramatic? Now, before you answer, let me say to this, Alasdair, that I'm agreeing with you totally that it is the value of the US currency which is falling, not gold increasing in price.
Well, there's quite a lot to unpack in that. You are right, I think, to take the modern financial era back to the aftermath of the First World War. And it was at that stage that the world's financial center moved from London to New York. Why was that? It was because the Americans lent an awful lot of dollars on various plans to Britain and European nations in the wake of the First World War. And so, in other words, the world's creditor was America. That is where the financial market therefore moved. And in repayment of debt in those days, it was very often done in gold. So gold began accumulating at the US Treasury or the Fed. So that was, if you like, in the sense, the start of our troubles, which we then had the Roaring Twenties, which was a massive expansion of credit, which eventually ended with the collapse of the stock market, made worse by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. So I'm hoping this is ringing a few bells with the situation today. We then, I mean, the gold, the dollar gold exchange rate was then changed officially from 20.67 to 35. That's the equivalent of a 40% devaluation for the dollar. This was under Franklin D. Roosevelt. And at that point, Americans were banned from owning real money. They could own it offshore, but they couldn't own it in America. So that was really the start of the troubles. And through subsequent years, basically, well, particularly after the Second World War, monetary inflation in America picked up substantially. You had wars in Korea and also in Vietnam and so on and so forth. And one way or the other, money supply increased very substantially. So that undermined the purchasing power of the dollar. But because the dollar was fixed at $35 to the ounce of gold, that effectively pulled gold down, if you like, with the dollar. And so we got to a stage, I mean, the only way in which this relationship was maintained was by America selling gold. And they reduced their gold position from something like 22,000 ounces in the late 1940s down to around about 9,000 tons when they finally gave up the ghost in 1971. Now, ever since then, basically, the policy has been to deny that gold is as part of the monetary system, that, in this great new world, this wonderful new world, the dollar is the principal currency, everything floats against it, and everybody's got to own dollars in their reserves. So that has now happened, but the dollar's credibility has been progressively undermined by its loss of purchasing power, and it's something that is now accelerating, and this is something that really should worry us. As to how long it will take for the authorities to wake up and take the correct remedial action, that is nowhere in sight at the moment. And I've always maintained that the only way in which the political situation will change is we've got to have a major crisis which will force the political class, backed by the population, who will then realize the danger themselves, to do something about it. Now, whether this goes down the rabbit hole, to use your phrase, of 1923 in Germany, where the paper mark got destroyed entirely before Helmut Schacht came in as the new head of the central bank and stabilized things, or whether before that happened, there is the political leadership, the statesmanship, if you like, to turn the thing round, which basically means cutting out all this welfare stuff, reducing it substantially. It also means turning round the deterioration in public morality, if I can put it that way, and get a work ethic back into things. I mean, this is no mean feat. It can only happen when we as individuals think, oh my God, where are we going? This is terrible. We've really got to find a solution to this and understand that radical action has to be taken, which means cutting welfare, cutting government spending. If you like, the sort of, the Argentinian chainsaw wielding president. I mean, it's an interesting analogy because Argentina's had decades of this corruption to the point where everybody was absolutely fed up with it and understood. I mean, I'm talking about the general public, and understood that it was the establishment, if you like, living off the people. That was the way the politics had become constructed.
Yeah.
We're beginning to understand this. When the very earliest stages are beginning to understand this, certainly in the UK. And I think, from what I read in America, also in America, I don't know about Australia, but you can see that, we are on this sort of evolution, if you like, in terms of thinking and all the rest of it. But as to the final outcome, I just wonder whether, in some countries, it's going to be virtually impossible without a major political change to stop the deterioration of fiat currencies in terms of their purchasing power. And even then, they're going to have to try and link credit somehow back to real money, corporeal money, as the lawyers would call it, which is physical gold with no counterparty risk. Just imagine what governments have got to do to their own finances to get to that stage. That is the challenge. And for a very long time, in this process of collapse, governments will resist this. I mean, the first thing we will see is when interest rates start rising, as they will, it'll be reflected in bond yields rather than, let's say, the Fed's policy or whatever. I mean, the Fed will be putting cuts on hold. And that's another topic, actually, the relationship with the president. But, the whole of the interest rate situation is going to deteriorate. Why? Because foreigners holding a currency and even domestic holders of currency increasingly see risk in that currency and need to have compensation for that risk. That is what a bond yield is. If you're going to buy something with a 10-year maturity, then you're not going to do it unless you can see a positive return on it. If you're seeing a negative return on it, you're not a charity. I mean, forget it. You're not in the wealth destruction business. So that, I think, is something which at the moment is an unanswered question as to quite how that is going to play out. But I can certainly see that the initial response from the monetary authorities around the world to rising interest rates will be to try and rescue their own banks where they've got into trouble, but also and particularly major zombies in the private sector. And these are zombies with political clout. You know, they've got the ear of congressmen and so on and so forth. So, you know, that's something that we're going to have to go through. The only answer, actually, at the end of the day, is to stand back and say, look, you got too much debt. It's your problem, not the nation's problem. You deal with it. We are nowhere near that psychology, nowhere near at all.
Yeah, it's only, I mean, I was looking at it as 54 years since 1971. And you can see the amount of money that governments spend to take care of this and take care of that, and not to allow private enterprise to get involved in it. But that's as I see it, it's an absolute wrong move. I mean, it's a system where people are asking governments to get ourselves out, get the country back in running order again. But they always go back to government to ask get this done and get that done, and yet it's the government running a deficit that is causing the problem. So, you know, it's I've seen in the last 5 years where, as I said in my question, that there used to be some big dips in the price of gold and silver, but not anymore. Right? They're becoming very shallow. And I think that, I am convinced that the gold standard will come back. I don't know, like Alasdair, we don't know when, but we're getting very, very close.